Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome here. The School of International Service, U.S. Foreign Policy program, chaired by Professor Shun Murray, is sponsoring this book launching. And I think that's a good word because what they're arguing in the book is that we should launch their book, not missiles, in dealing with the problem of Tehran. We're very fortunate here at SIS to have Hilary Mann Leverett as one of our professors. Both she and her husband are the second dynamic duo in foreign policy, perhaps only to the Secretary of State and her husband, who's escaping right now. They both worked in the National Security Council, in the State Department, intelligence community, worked on these very issues for a long period of time, and have devoted themselves since leaving the government to trying to explain that part of South Asia which has engaged our attention but not our minds. For too long, American diplomats have stopped trying to explain the first principle that they should have been taught and that they should practice, which is get into the shoes and the minds of your adversary. We don't do that anymore. We simply demonize our adversaries. We assume that they're irrational. We assume that they hate us. We assume that we can't make any progress. And sure enough, there is a self-fulfilling dimension to those assumptions. And that's why we're stuck. We're stuck with a 50-year-old non-relationship with Cuba. We're stuck with regard to North Korea. We're stuck with regard to Iran. We're stuck wherever we face an adversary that we just refuse to try to understand their perspective. Because if you do understand their perspective, you realize that they have real interest. They see the world differently than we do. And that's the beginning of where real negotiation should start. Not that we accept their perspective, not that we condone their perspective, not that we salute their interests, but that we understand our own interest and understand that if you want to reach some understanding with them, you're going to have to meet them halfway, and you're going to have to persuade them that you understand where they're coming from. And there are two countries, quite frankly, where we have been very, very bad in trying to do that. One is, of course, Cuba, and the other is Iran. And as a result, we're stuck. And so, for that reason, with a few others, not the least of which, the President of the United States has already said that it would be unacceptable if Iran acquired nuclear weapons, and implied that that would require a military option. And with the election occurring today in Israel, where the most likely winner, the current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said just yesterday, there is no problem with regard to settlements in the West Bank. There is only one foreign policy problem, and that's nuclear weapons in Tehran, and we will not abide by that. So within the next 6 months, it's incumbent upon all of us to learn everything that we possibly can that would permit us to make an educated judgment as a community as to whether war with Iran is the only step or even a good step. And to make that decision, there is, in my judgment, no better place to start than in the book which they've just written, Going to Tehran, Why the United States Must Come to Terms with the Islamic Republic. This is the book. It's out there. I strongly recommend it to all of you, and you all have the real advantage now of hearing from both of them. A summary of that argument, and also, more importantly, an in-depth understanding of Iran's perspective, so that we may better make a collective decision. So with that, I'm going to turn first to Hillary and then to Flint to speak.
Thank you, Bob, for both a very kind and really thoughtful introduction. It gives us a lot to think about even before we start today. Thank you very, very much. And thank you very much, Professor Murray, for the wonderful program that you run here and for hosting me to teach at this wonderful university with amazing students. Many of my students I see here and other faculty members who I'm grateful could come today. I'm going to start off, we're going to take basically two different parts of the book's arguments for you today. And I'm going to start off first with what I think are maybe two of the most provocative themes in our book, but are really at the heart of our book. The first is that we argue the United States is a power in relative decline in the Middle East. The second theme is that the biggest beneficiary of America's ongoing decline in the Middle East is the Islamic Republic of Iran. If you're not sure you agree with those statements, I want to ask you to compare the relative positions of the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran with where they are today, with where they were just over 10 years ago on the eve of 9/11. On the eve of 9/11, every single government in the Middle East, every single one, was either pro-American, like the governments in Egypt and Turkey, in negotiations in effect to become pro-American, like the Assad government in Syria or the Gaddafi government in Libya, or virulently anti-Iranian, like Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq or the Taliban government in Afghanistan. But today, because of elections, governments across the Middle East, in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Lebanon, Palestine, Turkey, and Iraq, are all no longer reflexively pro-American or anti-Iranian. They are all pursuing independent foreign policies, and they are all much less enthusiastic about strategic cooperation with the United States and much more open to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Simply put, today, relatively speaking, the United States is in a profoundly weaker position, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is in a significantly stronger position in the Middle East than we were just 10 years ago on the eve of 9/11. We argue in our book that the primary reason for this, why this has happened, is that there has been a dramatic shift in the Middle East's balance of power. We describe in our book how part of why this has happened is because of U.S. policy mistakes. But we also describe something that is vastly underappreciated, especially here in Washington, which is that part of the reason why this dramatic shift in the balance of power has happened in the Middle East is because of successes of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we argue in our book that these two, America's policy mistakes and the Islamic Republic's successes, are inextricably connected, and that in fact it is America's dysfunctional policy toward the Islamic Republic of Iran that is at the heart of America's decline in the Middle East. And that it will only be strategic realignment by the United States with the Islamic Republic of Iran that will enable America's strategic recovery in the Middle East. We unpack this argument by examining the bases for U.S. dominance in the Middle East. And we focus on something that has been increasingly driven since the end of the Cold War. And that's America's unique capability to project enormous amounts of conventional military power into the Middle East. No one else, not even China, can project this kind of hard military power into the Middle East. And no one else will be able to do so for years to come. This muscle has given the United States, extraordinary economic and political influence in the Middle East. And on top of that, it has reinforced our military and economic dominance in other key areas of the world. But we argue in our book that our failures in Afghanistan and Iraq have underscored for the world, and for Middle Eastern publics in particular, the limits of what U.S. military might can accomplish. We argue further that these failures in U.S. policy in the Middle East were not just idiosyncratic, ideologically generated products of the George W. Bush administration. We argue that they stem from a much deeper source that cuts across the partisan divide, across Democratic and Republican administrations. We describe it in our book as the United States essentially giving in to a post-Cold War temptation to act as an imperial power in the Middle East. This imperial turn in our Middle East policy, we argue, pursue really with very little regard for realities on the ground in the Middle East, has proven not just quixotic, but deeply damaging to U.S. interests. As a presidential candidate back in 2008, President Obama seemed to really understand this dynamic. And he pledged then to change, not just to withdraw troops from Iraq, but actually to change the very mindset, and he used that term mindset, that had gotten us into the strategic mistake of invading Iraq in the first place, and to seriously, significantly change America's Middle East policies. But instead, what we saw happen is that the Obama administration pursued the same sorts of policies as its predecessors, policies that did such significant damage to America's strategic position in the Middle East. As a result, for example, President Obama today is presiding over not just a stalled Middle East peace process. His administration is presiding over the very demise of a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And while the Obama administration's military intervention in Libya was clearly able to overthrow Gaddafi in the end, it is now incubating in Libya and maybe all of North Africa an even greater secure threat to America's security interests. And as we document in our book, President Obama has gone beyond President Bush in threatening the Islamic Republic of Iran to actually coming close to discrediting engagement as a strategy for dealing with the Islamic Republic of Iran by saying that he tried to reach out to them and failed, when in fact his administration never seriously tried. The result is today that on President Obama's watch, the Middle East balance of power has shifted even further away from the United States and our allies than it was at the end of the George W. Bush administration. So why is this? What's happened? We argue that beyond America's decline in the Middle East, that this aspect of the Islamic Republic becoming the biggest beneficiary of our mistakes really gets to this issue. We lay out how by pursuing a foreign policy and building a domestic political order that actually attracts Middle Eastern publics, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been able to take advantage of American mistakes to improve its own position dramatically in the Middle East. And the key to their success, the key to the Islamic Republic's success, has been beyond this shift in the relative distribution of power among important actors in the Middle East that I noted earlier. The critical thing that is changing is the Middle East balance of power itself. It is significantly changing. It is increasingly less defined by hard military capabilities, where the United States has the clear advantage and the Islamic Republic of Iran is relatively deficient. And it is increasingly more defined in terms of who can appeal to regional publics. Essentially a balance of influence, where the Islamic Republic has important advantages. As we explain in our book, the Islamic Republic is both encouraging and taking advantage of this significant transformation in the Middle East. One of the most remarkable things about it, about this shift in the Middle East balance of power and what the Islamic Republic of Iran is doing, is that it has had virtually nothing to do with Iran's use of military force or economic coercion. It's not about the Islamic Republic of Iran invading anybody or sanctioning anybody. It's mostly about their soft power. In our book, we try to set this in a strategic context. And a critical set of sources that we draw on to put it into a strategic context were the unique and unparalleled opportunities we have had over several years to sit and actually listen to diplomats, national security officials, and others inside the Islamic Republic of Iran who support their system and the country, to hear what they have to say, how they explain how the world looks strategically from their point of view, from their perspective. As Professor Pastor said, this is something that is today, unfortunately, rare in American analyses of countries like the Islamic Republic of Iran. We learned a lot of very important things. Some of them may seem quite basic, like from Tehran's perspective, one sees 15 neighboring states, nearly all of whom have been hostile to the very idea of an Islamic Republic. And not just hostile, but Iran's neighbor to its east, Afghanistan under the Taliban, stormed Iran's consulate in Mazar Sharif, killing all of its diplomats there. Iran's neighbor to its west, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, with help from Iran's other neighboring Arab states and the United States, invaded the Islamic Republic in its early years, killing over 300,000 Iranians. Today, many of those same neighboring Arab states today host thousands of American troops and billions of dollars worth of the most deadly weapon systems that the United States has, all poised and threatening to attack the Islamic Republic of Iran, to disarm it of weapons of mass destruction it does not have. These are real and significant security challenges. And to deal with them, the Islamic Republic of Iran has built, almost from scratch, a strong defensive military capability. But it today has virtually no capability to project its military power offensively beyond its borders. The real key to its national security success has been in this cultivation of a soft power strategy. It's a strategy that's critically important to understand. It seeks to galvanize regional publics' most intensely felt grievances, including their grievances against the United States and their grievances against Israel, and most importantly, their grievances against their own unrepresentative pro-Western regimes. And the Islamic Republic then aligns itself with those galvanized publics, with that galvanized public opinion itself, to constrain hostile neighboring governments from attacking it. Just think about how Bahrain's clearly angry, largely Shia population would react today if we used our Fifth Fleet based in their country to attack Iran. U.S. military planners could hope that that population would be passive, an assumption they had just 5 years ago. But today that seems clearly reckless. And reckless because Iran's strategy is working. Its soft power strategy is working. Its strategy to appeal to regional populations has worked to constrain the United States and to constrain what it sees, and what I think there's a lot of credibility to this, are hostile, unrepresentative, pro-Western governments. And Iran has, or the Islamic Republic more appropriately in this area, has reinforced these aspects of its soft power by picking what I would call winners. Now, it's really politically incorrect to say that in Washington, but I think, again, it's an accurate description in the regional arena. The Islamic Republic has essentially picked winners like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like the Shia parties in Iraq, like Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, as its political allies. And it has done this over years. It has picked these groups as its allies in key regional arenas. And today, its bet is paying off. Because today, each of these groups have become the most influential players in their regional arenas, the most influential players across the Middle East. The result is that today, it's the Islamic Republic of Iran and its ideas of participatory Islamist governance and independent foreign policy that have the real influence in countries from Egypt to Bahrain, which were clearly in the American camp. In strategic terms, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been and is using, through its narrative, not its drones, not its tanks, through its narrative, it is using the political awakening of Middle Eastern publics to alter the very nature of power politics in the Middle East. This is the core of its strategy in terms of foreign policy, and I'm now going to give it over to Flint to go more in depth.
Thank you. It's critically important for Americans and other Westerners to understand that it's really only an Islamic Republic of Iran which can accrue the kinds of soft power gains that Hillary's describing. The Shah couldn't have done it. A pro-Western secular Republic of Iran couldn't have done it. Only the Islamic Republic of Iran can do it. But as we discuss in our book, instead of recognizing this, American political policy and media elites persist in depicting the Islamic Republic as an illegitimate system so despised by its own population that it's in imminent danger of overthrow. American elites have been doing this for more than 30 years, virtually since the Islamic Republic's founding out of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And for more than 30 years, the Islamic Republic has consistently defied these relentless predictions of its collapse or defeat. One of the main arguments of our book is that the Islamic Republic has survived because its basic model, this integration of participatory politics and elections with principles and institutions of Islamic governance and a strong commitment to foreign policy independence, this model is, according to polls, electoral participation rates, and other indicators, this model is in actual fact what a majority of Iranians living inside their country want. They don't want a political order grounded in Western-style secular liberalism. They want an indigenously generated political order reflecting their cultural and religious values. As the reformist President Mohammad Khatami wrote shortly before he left office, they want, quote, freedom, independence, and progress within the context of both religiosity and national identity, close quote. That's what the Islamic Republic, with all its flaws, offers Iranians the chance to pursue. This was the vision of Imam Khomeini, embodied in the Islamic Republic's constitution. And even those Iranians who want the Islamic Republic to evolve in significant ways, at the end of the day, even most of them still want it to be the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the Islamic Republic has made progress in some impressive ways which further undergird its basic legitimacy. Contrary to deeply rooted but ill-informed Western stereotypes, the Islamic Republic has achieved far more progressive outcomes in alleviating poverty, delivering health care, providing educational access, and, yes, expanding opportunities for women than the Shah's regime ever did. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. The Islamic Republic has developed a healthcare system that has greatly increased life expectancy and greatly reduced infant and child mortality. The provision of health care to rural areas has been particularly impressive since the revolution. The Islamic Republic has basically equalized health outcomes across rural and urban settings in a manner which is really quite extraordinary in an international context. And get this. There are now Iranian doctors and public health specialists working with state universities and NGOs in Mississippi to introduce Iranian-style rural health care delivery into medically underserved parts of the Mississippi Delta. The Islamic Republic has also greatly expanded educational opportunities vastly increasing literacy rates, and, according to the World Bank, basically eliminating gender disparities in educational access. Let me repeat that. Basically eliminating gender disparities in educational access. On women's issues, I'm going to defer largely to Hillary and encourage you to draw her out in the Q&A because she's uncovered some really extraordinary details to back up the big picture statement that I'm about to make. That the biggest educational and social gains for Iranian women in the country's history have been achieved not under the Shah, but under the supposedly deeply misogynistic Islamic Republic. Notwithstanding the Islamic Republic's staying power, foreign policy pundits who in many cases have no direct connection to on-the-ground reality inside Iran, and so-called Iran experts, many of whom are Iranian expatriates or Iranian Americans whose families fled the revolution and don't want to see the Islamic Republic succeed, these commentators continue telling us that the system is on the verge of collapse. One of our themes in going to Tehran is that until Americans stop listening to the agenda-driven, fact-free analysis coming from such people, the United States will continue to get its Iran policy wrong and will continue losing ground in the Middle East. A good example of what I'm talking about in this regard came in 2009, when, in a collective act of analysis by wishful thinking, American elites widely anticipated a victory by former Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi over incumbent President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in that year's Iranian presidential election. Many American analysts saw a Mousavi victory as the de facto key to solving America's strategic problems with Iran and in the Middle East. When in June 2009 Ahmadinejad won, those same analysts and elites almost universally condemned the outcome as fraud. They did so even though every methodologically sound poll conducted in Iran before and after the election, including polls conducted by Western polling groups, 14 polls in all, showed that Ahmadinejad's re-election with roughly 2/3 of the vote, which is what the official results say he got, was eminently plausible. And American elites embraced a narrative of election fraud even though neither Mousavi nor anyone else ever presented any evidence of how the election was stolen. This never demonstrated but fervently espoused narrative conditioned American and Western elites' romanticization of the Green Movement, widely portrayed in the West as a mass popular uprising poised to sweep away the Islamic Republic, perhaps within just a few months. But it was evident to anyone prepared to look soberly at reality that even at its height, the Green Movement did not represent anything close to a majority of Iranians, and that within a week of the June 2009 election, the movement's social base was already contracting. And yet the myth of the Islamic Republic's illegitimacy and instability did not die as a result of the Green Movement's failure. Indeed, it got a new lease on life in early 2011 when the Arab awakening began. Through the pro-Green lens that continues to shape most Western commentary on Iranian politics, it seemed inevitable that the waves of popular discontent breaking across the Arab world would soon engulf the Iranian government too. Most of the pundits who had jumped on the regime change bandwagon in 2009 hopped back on for another ride. On February 21st, 2011, billionaire financier George Soros, appearing on CNN's GPS with Fareed Zakaria, offered a bet that, quote, the Iranian regime will not be there in a year's time, close quote. 2 days later, in foreign policy, Hillary and I took Soros up on his wager. Now, I acknowledge that the notion of two former U.S. government officials turned college professors betting George Soros on anything might seem rather absurd, but that's what we did. We even bet that not only would the Islamic Republic still be Iran's government in a year's time, but that the balance of influence and power in the Middle East would be tilted even further in its favor. Almost 2 years have elapsed now since Soros made his wager, and I must say we're pretty eager to collect on it. Over the last couple of years, we've also had the New York Times, other mainstream media outlets going to the same sorts of questionable sources and the same so-called Iran experts who had proven themselves so colossally wrong on the 2009 election and on the Green Movement, tell us that perceived tensions between President Ahmadinejad and the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, were quote-unquote unprecedented signs of an insecure regime fracturing at the top. The Times even told us last year, in its main analytic piece about the 2012 parliamentary elections, that Khamenei had had his son rig the elections so that he could get rid of Ali Larijani as Speaker of the Parliament, install a relative by marriage as Speaker, abolish the presidency to get rid of Ahmadinejad, and make the Islamic Republic a prime ministerial system with a prime minister he could presumably more easily control. Wow. Not a single one of these points was correct. Not a single one of them came to pass. In fact, they couldn't come to pass, because altering the Islamic Republic's constitution in this manner can only be done by popular referendum, and there's precedent for that. But the Times fed us this stuff anyway. More broadly, tensions between elected presidents and the leader in Iran are hardly new, and they're not an indicator of systemic crisis. They are politics as usual in a system with multiple power centers and institutionalized checks and balances. But in the fact-free approach of many so-called Iran experts here in the United States, if Iranians display the sort of contestation over policy and relative position within their system that virtually everywhere else in the world we call normal politics, then our Iran experts tell us that this is something abnormal and pathological, and that the system must be coming apart. It is not. Today, the myth of the Islamic Republic's illegitimacy and fragility come in two interlocking versions. One, sanctions are now finally working to undermine the Islamic Republic's basic stability. And two, that the Arab awakening has left the Islamic Republic isolated in its own neighborhood. On sanctions, Hillary and I just come back from our most recent visit to Iran last month. No one who has walked the streets of Tehran recently, seen that Iran's economy is not collapsing, and talked with a range of Iranians inside Iran could possibly think that sanctions are working in a way that will compel either the Islamic Republic's implosion or it's a surrender to American demands on the nuclear issue. On the Arab awakening, the same pundits who say that sanctions are working advise you to embrace the logic-defying proposition that the same social currents that deposed pro-American leaders in Tunisia and Egypt and are empowering Islamists in countries across the Arab world will, in Iran, somehow transform the Islamic Republic into a secular liberal state. This is truly logic-defying. What all of this consistently getting Iran wrong reflects, we think, is a delusion that the United States is still basically in control of the strategic situation in the Middle East. Sanctions, we are told, are inflicting ever-rising hardship on the Iranian economy. Either Tehran will surrender to U.S. demands that it stop enriching uranium, or the Iranian public will rise up and transform the Islamic Republic into a pro-Western liberal state. And if neither of these two things happens, then at some point the American military will destroy Iranian nuclear installations. This is a truly dangerous delusion, grounded in persistent American illusions about Middle Eastern reality. For its own interests, Washington must take a fundamentally different approach, an approach captured in the title of our book, Going to Tehran, and in its subtitle, Coming to Terms with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The United States needs to come to terms with the Islamic Republic, this rising revolutionary power, not as a favor to Iran, but to save its own strategic position in the Middle East and avert the strategic catastrophe of another Middle Eastern war. Coming to terms with the Islamic Republic means accepting it as a legitimate political order representing legitimate national interests, and as a rising regional power unwilling to subordinate its foreign policy to Washington. No American president since the Iranian Revolution, not even Barack Hussein Obama, has been prepared to do this. But it's a key argument in our book that this is not just the only basis on which diplomacy with Iran can succeed, it's the only way for Obama to avert strategic catastrophe in his second term. There is an important precedent in recent American history for the kind of diplomacy we are talking about. Accepting a rising regional power as a legitimate entity pursuing its interests in a fundamentally rational and defensive way is how President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger enabled the historic opening to China in the early 1970s. Their achievement was not to talk to Beijing. Washington had been doing that for years through ambassadorial level discussions. Those discussions were exceedingly narrow, focused primarily on American grievances and demands, and as Kissinger described it, served only to institutionalize stalemate. Sound familiar? Nixon and Kissinger's achievement was not to talk to Beijing. It was to accept and to persuade Americans to accept the People's Republic as, in Nixon's words, a nation pursuing its own interests as it perceives these interests, just as we follow our own interests as we see them. For 20 years, from the time of the Chinese Revolution, the United States had tried to isolate and undermine the People's Republic. It had pursued not just a policy of regime change toward the People's Republic, it had supported and recognized this entire other political structure based in Taiwan as the quote-unquote real government of China. And the results of this had been disastrous for the United States. It had undermined our strategic position in Asia and had gotten us into the disastrously draining quagmire of the Vietnam War. Nixon came to office recognizing the imperative of rapprochement with Beijing. His initiative to realign relations with China saved America's position in Asia after the draining disaster of Vietnam and restored Washington's global leadership. If Obama accepted the Islamic Republic in the same way, an equally thorough realignment of U.S.-Iranian relations would be possible. But it is possible only on the basis of that sort of acceptance. We're going to see over the next 4 years if Obama is up to that. Thank you very much.
We'd be happy to take questions and to really have a fulsome discussion with everyone as possible. Yes, Professor Better.
Thank you very much. This is really mind-bending and I think deserves to be heard very broadly in Washington. If I could ask you, though, both of you mentioned how talking to Iran would actually strengthen U.S. strategic interests in the Middle East, but neither of you defined what U.S. strategic interests are. So would you help us by defining your own perspective on what U.S. strategic interests are?
Let me take about two or three questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Caroline.
I was wondering if you guys could offer your perspective on what a new Obama administration, what kind of changes we might see, what kind of attitude changes we might see towards the Middle East, particularly in regards to, I know he's just DOD, but maybe Chuck Hagel or Karen Fleck and John Kerry, what they might bring to the table.
Okay.
I was wondering if you had the chance to inform any government officials of your argument, and if so, what's the response to that? And Also, what's your position on the repression of the Green Movement and the accusations of the Iranian regime repressing any protest against the system?
Okay, that sounds good.
Would you like to?
Do you want to start and then I'll go to next one?
I'll do the next one. Okay. In terms of U.S. strategic interests and how rapprochement with Iran would shore up the American position in the Middle East, I think that core interests in the Middle East for the United States are obviously free flow of hydrocarbons from the Persian Gulf. We also, we have a stated interest in a safe and secure Israel. And particularly in the aftermath of 9/11, we have defined as a high priority interest the containment of both, let me call them, jihadi movements and ideologies, which are the seeding ground for mass casualty terrorist attacks against the United States or U.S. interests. If you take those as kind of a baseline of what U.S. strategic interests in the region are, I think that U.S. rapprochement with Iran would help us enormously on all fronts. I would say right now the biggest threat to the free flow of oil from the Persian Gulf is the threat of American military action against Iran. Iran is not going to try to close the Strait of Hormuz out of the clear blue. It's not going to try and impede the flow of tanker traffic out of the Persian Gulf, on its own initiative. Those scenarios only become operative in scenarios where, very serious strategic threats are being directed against Iran. If you want a free flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf, U.S.-Iranian rapprochement effectively guarantees you that. In terms of Israel, I think that one of the mistakes that the U.S. has made that Hillary alluded to in her remarks, there's some very obvious mistakes like the Iraq War, which I think have really undermined the American position in the region in several different ways. But I think another mistake that we have made in the post-Cold War period is we have essentially provided open-ended support for an Israeli strategy, which I think Israeli planners misleadingly label deterrence, but which is essentially an assertion by Israel of a prerogative to use military force first, disproportionately, and not just to preempt perceived threats, but to prevent threats that Israeli planners are concerned might somehow emerge. It's a strategy of kind of unilateral military dominance. And by supporting that, I think the United States has really done real damage to its strategic position in the Middle East. The flip side of coming to terms with the Islamic Republic is basically for the United States being able to draw a distinction between Israeli security and Israeli, let's say, strategic preferences. You don't have to just take my word for it. Ehud Barak has said this on the record. Tons of Israeli generals and senior intelligence officials currently serving or recently retired have said this on the record. The big problem with a quote-unquote nuclear Iran from an Israeli standpoint, not even necessarily nuclear weapons, just even an Iran that has a certain amount of indigenous fuel cycle capability. The big problem with that, Barak has said this on the record, it's not that Iranians would nuke Israel. It's that the next time Israel thinks it needs to reinvade southern Lebanon or Gaza, they might have to think twice about it. Now, Barak has said it doesn't necessarily mean Israel won't do it, but the strategic calculation and decision-making becomes more complicated. I don't think it's in American interest to ensure Israel's ability to invade southern Lebanon. And if we don't sort of detach ourselves from that, and I think coming to terms with the Islamic Republic is an important part of detaching ourselves from that. If we can't learn to draw a distinction between Israeli security and these kinds of Israeli strategic preferences, then our strategic position in the Middle East, is, particularly in this environment, is really going to continue to decline. And then in terms of jihadi groups, it has just come to strike me increasingly as really ironic that Al-Qaeda would not exist but for Saudi Arabia. The Taliban would not exist but for Saudi Arabia. And the State Department says that Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. The biggest potential, right now, the Saudis, our allies, are doubling down on a strategy of supporting groups and movements with, and I don't use this term lightly, an Al-Qaeda-like ideology and agenda across the Middle East. They've done it and are doing it in Libya. They are doing it in Syria. They are doing it elsewhere. Now, this may make sense from a Saudi perspective. There is no way that this is in American interests. And the only way we can really begin to contain that, and the only way we can really begin to come to terms with Islamist governance in a way that's going to give us a shot at restoring some measure of credibility with regional publics in the Middle East, is by coming to terms with the Islamic Republic.
We have the other two questions.
Yeah,
Have you gotten any response from the Obama administration, and also your views of the repression of the Green Movement?
I'm going to start, though, with just add just a couple of points to what Clint said. The first on terrorism, which is critically important, and one of the driving reasons we wrote this book was that I had this, in particular, very unique opportunity. When I worked for the U.S. government, first for the State Department and then for the National Security Council, I was one of a very small number of American officials authorized to speak to, actually say hello to, but then have a substantive discussion with Iranian officials at the United Nations over Afghanistan. And it started right before 9/11, which is why I think we were able to get it started. Nobody really cared about Afghanistan at the time. And then after 9/11, because it was ongoing, we were able to continue. As part of these talks, at that time, Khatami government offered to start counterterrorism negotiations with us. And to start it when President Khatami was coming that year, normally the UN opens every year in September. That year, because of the terrorist attacks here, it wasn't opening until November, and they wanted to start it with when Khatami came in November, and he wanted to come and to kind of give a symbolic start to it. He wanted to go to Ground Zero and say a prayer and actually light a candle, because there had been a candlelight vigil in Tehran. People had come into the streets of Tehran after 9/11 in sympathy with the people who died in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania with this candlelight vigil. But that was declined in Washington. And I think the heart of it, beyond people not being such great policymakers, the heart of it is something that Americans have really not come to terms with at all, the difference between what we see as terrorism and some people see as resistance. It's different than just your clear-cut terrorism. People can still disagree about whether a particular act or movement is practicing or promoting resistance or terrorism, but it's different than what Al-Qaeda is doing in a lot of ways. And what Iran does, and again, for some people this may be a distinction without a difference, but it's important to think through and see from their perspective. They are supporting groups, whether they're in Iraq or in Lebanon or Palestine, that they see as pursuing resistance, not just random wanton acts of killing for some vague purpose. So that's another thing that I think is important as we continue to define and evolve our interests in the Middle East. If we continue to look at terrorism as this broad monolith, we are going to lose out on this important distinction. The other piece on Israel that I think is critically important to deal with as well, as we continue to have this interest in a safe and secure Israel, that is changing before our eyes, and it comes to a part of the talk that I gave when we first started this afternoon. The threat is not coming, as Flint mentioned, from the number of centrifuges Iran has in Iran. It's coming from people having more of a say. It's coming from the possibility that Egypt may not want to continue the peace treaty that it's had the way it's had it. Now, what we're saying in terms of coming to terms with the Islamic Republic of Iran that would apply to Egypt and all the other countries that will eventually have to respond to their regional publics, that peace treaty itself, the demands put on it, to have it with a dictator like Sadat or Mubarak, number one, was problematic. And then to try to put the demands on him, Mubarak, Sadat, and then Mubarak, to have a peace treaty that was more than not war, but to try to force, in a sense, a collusion of Egypt in Israel's policies was very dangerous and eroding for the population inside Egypt today. Inside Egypt, it bred over time even more hatred and resentment of what the Israeli government was doing inside Israel, its internal practices and its foreign policy. So, for example, to try to, or to force Egypt to keep a civilian population under siege in Gaza, I think was one of the last straws for the Mubarak government. Coming to terms with the Islamic Republic of Iran would mean not that the Islamic Republic of Iran is going to sign that kind of peace treaty with Israel. It would mean for Americans having to figure out how to support a safe and secure Israel where the region still has questions about its fundamental legitimacy after 60 years. How does it legitimate itself besides having a strong military that can enforce acquiescence from its neighbors? So those are the two things I would just note on strategic interests. Have we been able to inform government officials? We used to be more proactive about that. We had come out of government. We were not Republicans or Democrats. We were both career. I was a career foreign service officer. Flint was a career intelligence analyst at the CIA. And so the contacts we had were not political. Some of them today are at the highest levels of the U.S. government, though. We were initially very proactive in keeping them informed. But as you see this changing balance of power in the Middle East, I think there's also been a change in terms of power and what is heard in our own country. And so it's not so much, the readout we can give to Deputy Secretary of State or Deputy Secretary of the Treasury or someone at the National Security Council. It's more about what we can write, what we can get out into the public sphere. So that's where we concentrate more of our efforts in terms of what we can get out. One other point before I get to the Green Movement is just in terms of the administration, Caroline's question. I think we are today possibly facing some opportunities with Obama's appointments if they're confirmed by the Senate. We've had the opportunity to brief both Senators Hagel and Kerry. I have a lot of respect for them. I think they both have well-grounded, well-developed visions for America in the world, which is very, very important. Are essentially non-interventionist in some important ways. Both served, of course, in the Vietnam War and came to criticize it. I think would be hesitant to get us into another war again. So there's some, we both, I think, share some optimism. But on the other hand, what we see lacking in the entire debate, not just for these two appointments, is anything that takes the debate beyond sanctions or bombing. There's just nothing in the debate about accepting the Islamic Republic as it is, as this rising revolutionary power that's critically important at a strategic crossroads. Nothing in the debate at all. And I think for both Senators Kerry and Hagel, they might find that argument interesting, but does it really come into their strategic calculus? We can hope, but I haven't seen the evidence for it. To the last question, which is very important as well, the repression of the Green Movement. We argue, I'd say, three different things in our book. The first would say that we make some comparisons first. The first is for us, and we came to it this way without really focusing on the domestic back and forth inside the Islamic Republic. Our first strategic driver, looking at the Middle East and looking at Iran, was like China. And when Nixon and Kissinger developed and then went to China, went to Beijing, did the opening, the rapprochement with China, China was still at the height of the Cultural Revolution, had killed at least 3 million people. China didn't just have an enrichment program, they had nuclear weapons. They had nuclear weapons. So the comparison in terms of the Islamic Republic of Iran today with what we have put up with, what we dealt with, what we came to terms with in the People's Republic of China and other places, we say doesn't even compare. It's nowhere near the level of both human and strategic concern that we would have had with China today. The other is that when we looked really hard at what was going on inside the Islamic Republic of Iran, revolutions are hard to make. That's why there are so few of them. They're hard. People have to be willing to fight and die. And as tragic as every loss of life has been inside the Islamic Republic of Iran, every life that has fought for more freedom, for their voice to be heard more, as tragic as every one of those lives are, it's something that they would have to keep fighting for if they want to have another revolution. By the Green Movement's own numbers, less than 100 people died in 2009. Now again, that is terrible. And the government claims something like 37 or 38 people. Again, every loss of life is terrible. But if you compare, say even 100, maybe even if you double that, to other places around the world, is that really what a revolution is, how a revolution is going to come? And if people want it, they would keep coming back. If you compare what happened in 2009 with what happened in 1979, when there was a revolution inside Iran, when the Shah's troops fired on people, not only did people come back, but those crowds grew larger. In Egypt, when the military and others fired or sent their camels with the whips in to beat people in Tahrir Square, the crowds got bigger.
And you had 1,000 people killed in Egypt.
And you had 1,000 people
And we say
killed.
the Egyptian military was statesmanlike.
It was honorable in how it let people come in. But the exact figure was 986 documented that were killed. So again, we come back to, we don't agree with repression, we don't like it. But if you compare it in terms of whether this is going to change the situation, whether there's going to be a revolution, there's not a social base for it inside the Islamic Republic. And so it made us delve deeper into why is that? What really makes a social base inside the Islamic Republic of Iran? And again, it's not a perfect system, but it is a system that is true to the majority of the people's, not just their religion, their beliefs, their histories, their concerns, but in a lot of ways it's a developmental state. It's a state that actually delivers. It delivers in terms of a better life for people. You compare the Islamic Republic of Iran today with where it was 32 years ago. 32 years ago, the literacy rate for women was 32%, 17% in rural areas. Today, it's over 95%. And that's educational access at all levels. If you think about the healthcare that Flint went through, that's something that people had no access to healthcare. Today, there's universal access to healthcare that really delivers inside Iran. You constantly hear problems with the economy. Of course, there are problems with the economy. But this is still an economy that has delivered and has brought people overwhelmingly into the middle class. Overwhelmingly into the middle class. And one of the things that you see happening, one of the reasons why there could even be protests in 2009, was the transformation that educational access and economic opportunity have had, that people are so politically aware and politically active and politically knowledgeable inside Iran. So in terms of the repression of the Green Movement, I would say the very unpopular thing, again, it's, if there's going to be a revolution in Iran, people who are in the Green Movement, which I think is largely dissipated, would have to fight a lot harder for there to be real change.
I think at this point, the Green Movement has very little social base left. Even the reformists who want to keep participating in Iranian politics, they have basically distanced themselves from what's left of the Green Movement.
One last piece on that is that the other part here is that it wasn't just a protest because people were fed up. Something happened. People were told by the candidate, Mir Hussein Mousavi, that there was fraud. So, we've spoken to a range of Mousavi's campaign advisors, both his senior advisors and student advisors at the university that organized for his campaign. And what's amazing is none of them can even, what their frustration was, that they couldn't even decide on what the narrative was for how the fraud could have happened. So you had the protests when people thought and were told there was fraud. But when it became increasingly clear that not only was there no evidence for this fraud, but people couldn't even agree to how the fraud could have happened, there wasn't an organizing element driving people into the street. So here we're comfortable in the narrative that it's all repression, but when you go to the university in Tehran, people say, well, we don't really have reason to protest at this point.
Let's take some more. Sure.
I think it would be remarkable if the United States did go to Iran. But let's say it did.
Yeah.
I think that there are hardened views on both sides. How would the United States be received?
Well, we.
Hold on.
Sorry.
Let's take
Yeah.
So that's also it's an incredible approach about negotiations and to sit face to face with the Iranians, solve all the pending issues. But I fully understand the change of power in the region and what leverage gives to the Iranian to use it as a bargaining chip in the negotiations. But how you will rebuild this trust while you met both teams? From Iran and the United States. Did you witness any sense of cooperation to negotiate these issues like an issue to issue and not a package deal style? Because it's always reaches a deadlock in the negotiations when you link it to Hezbollah, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and the nuclear issue, where there is a willingness between both Americans and Iranians about this.
Let me ask the third question on this cluster, and we'll come back to one more cluster after that. That's and follows from these last two conversations. Flint, in particular, you laid out three interests for the United States: oil, jihadis, and Israel. But you neglected the principal interest that has been restated now by the president many times and by the leader of the Republican Party as well, which is on nuclear weapons. Also, both of you have written that actually Iran doesn't really want nuclear weapons. So coincident with these last two questions about how Iran would react to the United States, whether there would be cooperation and willingness, could you spell out for us what is the nature of a potential deal? It seems to me if our principal interest is pledge and verification of not building nuclear weapons, and in particular with regard to the enrichment process, the Iranians have already said that they don't. Tell me what a deal might look like that we would want to pursue.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let me go ahead and start then with the last question on the nuclear issue. I first worked for the U.S. government in 1992 and began hearing then that Iran was 3 to 5 years away from having a nuclear weapon. And that's been the basic view of both the U.S. and the Israeli intelligence communities ever since. Sometimes the Israelis come with more alarmist assessments, but for more than 20 years now, we've said they're 3 to 5 years away from a nuclear weapon, and here we are 20 years later, and we just kind of keep pushing this out further and further. Okay? What's going on here? I actually don't think the Iranians want a nuclear weapon. I think they are pushing the limits of their non-proliferation obligations for a lot of different reasons. But even the U.S. and the Israeli intelligence communities have said publicly that there's been no decision taken in Iran to fabricate nuclear weapons. I would go further than that. I mean, we have people, close advisors to foreign leaders who have met with Ayatollah Khamenei, who says that he has told them specifically, it's not just that he hasn't made a decision not to nuclearize, to weaponize, it's that he has given very firm directions that there is to be no weaponization. Why? Well, aside from a lot of good strategic reasons, and across the board, reformists, conservatives, the leading strategic thinkers in Iran are pretty close to unanimity that it would be a really stupid idea for Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And even more than that, you have now religious statements from Khomeini and at several points during Khamenei's tenure as supreme leader that nuclear weapons are haram. They're forbidden by God. It is a violation of God's law to have, much less use, such weapons. You may say, okay, that's just talk. Okay, but in a system that legitimates itself in terms of its adherence to God's law, statements like that, I think it would be hard for Khamenei or for some future leader to come out and say, all that stuff that Imam Khomeini and Ayatollah Khamenei said about nuclear weapons being haram, well, never mind. I think that's hard to do. But beyond that, there's an historical precedent that we might actually want to take this somewhat seriously. During the Iran-Iraq War, when Iraq for years was attacking not just Iranian military units, but Iranian cities with chemical weapons. And the United States was blocking any action by the Security Council on this issue. The Revolutionary Guard leadership came to Khomeini and said, we inherited from the Shah the capacity to produce chemical weapons agents. We need to mass produce this stuff and weaponize it so we can retaliate in kind, and maybe this will stop. And Imam Khomeini, in the middle of this war, when they're already under chemical attack, he says no. Because chemical weapons are haram. They are forbidden by God, and the Islamic Republic will not do this. And they didn't do it even when they're being subjected to years of chemical weapons attack. Okay. I don't think they want a nuclear weapon. Regardless of what I think, okay, what's the deal that could be had? The deal is very, very straightforward, and the Iranians have been utterly explicit about it. You, the United States, and your negotiating partners accept our right to enrich uranium. We have a sovereign right to do it, and under the NPT, we have a treaty-based right to do it under international safeguards. You accept our right to enrich uranium under safeguards. We will accept more intrusive monitoring verification measures. We will ratify and implement the additional protocol to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We will accept the Code 3.1 notification requirements on new nuclear facilities, other arrangements like that should give you confidence that the proliferation risks associated with our enriching uranium, risks that are there in any country that enriches uranium, but that those proliferation risks are under control. It may even be possible in that context that we would even agree to certain negotiated limits on our nuclear activities, like the issue of enrichment at 20%. To fuel the Tehran research reactor versus 3 to 4% that you need to create fuel for normal power reactors. There may be some things that could be negotiated there. But on the nuclear issue, that is the fundamental deal. The United States acknowledges Iran's right to enrich uranium under safeguards, and the Islamic Republic accepts, more intrusive monitoring and verification. That's the deal.
But that would require acceptance of the Islamic Republic as a legitimate political entity, which we argue is something that no American administration has done and at this point seems willing to do. That is the crux of the problem. And I think it comes into your question, both questions, in terms of how the United States would be received. The United States, this is something else we document in the book, has had numerous episodes of engagement They're not just the one that I was involved with on Afghanistan, but we start off, we've been talking to officials from the Islamic Republic really from the beginning. In the 1980s, it was we asked Iran's help to get our hostages out of Lebanon. It collapses here, it becomes known as the Iran-Contra scandal, not because Iran didn't deliver, but because American officials took the money they got from the Iranians and sent them to Contras in Nicaragua. So in terms of the trust, the Iranians, we talked to officials involved in that episode. They were fully prepared to keep talking to the Americans after that. They didn't really understand why it was so embarrassing here. This is what you wanted to do with your foreign policy. Why didn't you just do it? They talked to us again, the first Bush administration, the Bush 41 administration, we asked their help again to get the remaining U.S. hostages out of Lebanon. And they essentially deliver then, too. Not everything we've asked for, but they do deliver. There's the UN envoy who was charged with doing it has written a book about this, and about how in the end, even though at the time National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft had said that the U.S. would reciprocate Iranian steps to help us get our hostages out, in the end, Soviet Union collapsed. Iraq was no longer a formidable military threat. We didn't need to reciprocate to Iran. The Iranians still, we decide that we want to get Muslims to the besieged. We want to get weapons to besieged Muslims in Bosnia. Who better to get weapons to Muslims in Bosnia but Iran? It already had a pipeline going. That too implodes here because then candidate Dole, who was on the Intelligence Committee, made it clear he would make it very difficult for President Clinton. We talked to them again over Afghanistan. That was a very constructive engagement. The Iranians were critical to helping us not only oust the Taliban and set al-Qaeda on the run for Pakistan, but they helped us set up an entirely new government with 36 ministries. The Iranians were instrumental to try to get someone who would represent every part of the government, every part of the country, every ethnic group, every sectarian group into that government. They were critically important. We wouldn't have had Karzai. Now maybe people will say that was not such a good thing, but at the time this was enormously constructive. And we gave them the Axis of Evil speech at the end of that episode. So the receptivity to American entreaties to the Iranians has over time been pretty consistent. And even if you look directly in terms of U.S.-Iranian relations, not only did Khatami make this request when I was in New York to have counterterrorism negotiations with us and to go to Ground Zero to say a prayer and to light this candle, but even President Ahmadinejad wrote a 20-page letter to President Bush articulating how this is something that diplomacy was a critical way forward, and he gave this interesting kind of exposition about how the Prophet Muhammad had sent emissaries, and this was something really deep in their tradition. The Bush administration ridiculed it. They showed it to other foreign leaders to show how crazy he was. Still, President Ahmadinejad thought there was a new beginning with President Obama coming into office, and sent him almost immediately, November 2008, a congratulatory letter. All of these things were approved by the Supreme Leader Khamenei, and there was no response from President Obama. So there's been repeated interest. The other thing that we go through in our book is that it's not just America's interest that we need to have the rapprochement with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran is in a bad neighborhood. It's in a hostile neighborhood with all of these neighbors. But for Iraq today, are in a lot of ways inherently hostile to the idea of an Islamic Republic in terms of their own current configuration. So Iran needs this as well. We just to finish this last point, one of the problems that has happened because we've actually had repeated episodes of engagement where essentially the Iranians see, and I think there's a lot of credibility to their argument on this, that they did not all but much of what we asked, and then the situation was didn't just stand still for them. After each of these episodes of engagement we had with them, we sanctioned Iran more and got closer to the brink of conflict, something else that we document in the book. So to break out of this cycle, we argue that it's really necessary in order to establish some level of trust, some level of realigning the relationship for the United States, for the president, to not just go to Tehran physically, but intellectually and strategically. And we think that there's a lot of basis for why in the 32 years they would be receptive to it. But even if he's not, even if they're not, we also lay out what the situation was for Nixon going to China. Nixon didn't know he would have a meeting with Chairman Mao when he went. The Chinese refused to say whether he'd even be received. A few weeks before Nixon and Kissinger go to China for their first historic trip, the then Emperor of Ethiopia went. And when the Emperor of Ethiopia went, children went to the airport with flags of Ethiopia and were cheering. They were lining the streets going into Beijing. It was a very celebratory mood. When Nixon went, people were told not to leave their house. If they had to leave their homes, they shouldn't smile, they shouldn't do anything. The reception was cold. It was very, very cold to Nixon when he first went. The propaganda, I would describe it, maybe Chinese would describe it differently at the time, against the United States as bloodthirsty, ferocious imperialists was very strong inside China. And it's strong inside a lot of parts of the Islamic Republic of Iran today. But this idea of accepting the Islamic Republic by going, first is strategically and intellectually, but then physically by going, we argue it's something that's hard to take back, not just in the China example, but even Sadat's visit to Jerusalem. So even if Egypt decides today that the peace treaty as it is, and I think they're increasingly going in this direction, is untenable the way it is, in the way that Egypt is essentially, they see it, forced to collude with Israeli policies that they're so deeply against, that they're not going to entirely sever their relationship and go to war. Because to take back that recognition after going to the other capital is something very, very hard to do.
Okay, let's get a couple, because we only have 10 minutes left. So let's have those two questions over there.
In terms of rapprochement with Iran and regional strategy, how would the United States pursue that if, or considering our other relationships in the region, Israel aside, I'd say mainly Saudi Arabia, what would it be willing to sacrifice in terms of that relationship, especially with potential threats from Al-Qaeda-like groups and our reliance on their hydrocarbon energy?
What would we
the
sacrifice?
last question too.
Okay. Thanks very much for coming. My question is dealing kind of with the issue of political will versus mistaken identity. You kind of touched on the idea about how you think a lot of the problem comes from a misunderstanding of the Iranian policy. But it seems to me that the facts very often are on the side of your argument. I mean, you have IDF General Benny Gantz even saying that Iran is a rational actor, as well as Leon Panetta admitting that they're pursuing a nuclear capability over nuclear weapons. So with that in mind, would you say that it's safe to say that more of the problem is an issue of political will versus one of actual misunderstanding, especially when we see so many of the top military and intelligence leadership affirming the fact that Iran is in fact a rational actor?
One more? Or?
I think that's it.
You talked about the soft power leverage of Iran. So can you dwell more on that? What tools was Iran using for its soft power?
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
On Saudi Arabia, we were just in Iran over the winter break, and we also were on the other side of the Gulf, particularly in the United Arab Emirates, which I think has somewhat of a similar concern that Saudi Arabia does. You hear this throughout the Gulf. We've heard this in Saudi Arabia numerous times. That essentially an American coming to terms with the Islamic Republic of Iran is a zero-sum game for them, and that they would lose in that kind of scenario. There are two things that we say to them, which is, well, one thing that we say to them and one thing we don't say as much when we're there. The first is, if you compare to China, at the time, our allies were deeply concerned about an American opening to China. Our allies in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan especially were deeply, deeply concerned. But particularly for countries like Japan, and I would argue for all three of them, particularly for Japan, the rapprochement with China did not mean the end of an American relationship, a very privileged relationship with Japan. In fact, I would argue that Japan's political and economic boon largely develops after the rapprochement with China. So it was very much in their interests in the end, even though today you see more conflict between the two. The other piece, which we don't say as loudly when we're in the Gulf, is that things will change in the Gulf. The trajectory is on the side for change, and it's the nightmare scenario that most people in Washington don't even get anywhere near, is that of Saudi Arabia without the Saudi in front of it. So, should we hedge or not go through with a rapprochement with the Islamic Republic of Iran for this, I would call fantasy at this point, that Saudi Arabia can continue with the way that it is? When I outlined kind of the change in the regional balance of power for the United States since 9/11, you could make a similar argument for Saudi Arabia. That Saudi Arabia on the eve of 9/11 had a regional balance of power very much in its favor. Not only the states of the GCC, but all over the Middle East. Today, they are essentially surrounded and isolated. So in terms of, you don't want to give up on a relationship. There are a lot of things that are enduring and powerful about Saudi Arabia. I wouldn't underestimate Saudi Arabia. It's the one country really in the Middle East that never was subject to European colonialism and stark influence. There's a lot indigenously that they have going for them in terms of their national security strategy, their indigenous wealth, their indigenous ideology, and their religion. So there's a lot there, but there's also tremendous division and concern that I have about Saudi Arabia. So, the two together, we can't count on Saudi Arabia being in that form forever. And, what happened with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. For facts, before I attend to you, we were in New York, and this diplomat who negotiated basically for the United States to get our hostages out of Lebanon, who's a UN diplomat, who's written this book, Man Without a Gun? The Diplomat Without a Gun?
Yeah, I think it's Man Without a Gun.
Yeah. Which was in oblivion. I have it as required reading in some of my classes. But he's actually now, with the release of Argo, he's gotten a lot of bids for his book. So they still have it, my students who keep it. Johnny Pico.
John Domenico Pico,
Domenico Pico. He asked us this exact question, whether facts matter in the American debate.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say one more thing on the Saudi point. In terms of what the U.S. would lose or something. This is another thing we really don't say very much in Saudi Arabia when we're there. But put it crudely, where the hell else is Saudi supposed to go? And in terms of their hydrocarbons and so forth, the reality is they, just over the last few years, the Saudis are having to spend so much more money domestically out of concern for the potential restiveness of their own population. They now need $100 a barrel oil. And the amount of oil that they're going to have, the idea that they can, turn on the tap and play this central banker for oil, they may once have been able to do that. I think their ability to play that role is in very, very rapid decline. So, I don't think it costs the United States a lot in terms of the relationship with the Saudis to do what we're recommending. In terms of facts and your question really about political will versus understanding. I think there is a real deficit in political will on this issue. And I think it probably is going to take an American president who's willing to lead rather than follow public discourse on this. And, that's basically what Nixon did with China. There was an extraordinary amount of myth-making and demonization of the People's Republic going on when Nixon came to office. Foreign policy thinkers had been ruminating about the idea of opening to China for some time, but it was just politically radioactive. Nixon basically wired the opening in secret. Probably not more than 10 people in the whole U.S. government knew what was really going on. Nixon's Secretary of State was not one of those 10. And then he essentially sprang a fait accompli on the American public. And the American public responded so well to it that what would have been very formidable domestic opposition to the opening was really put on the defensive. I think it's also going to take political will, and this gets back to something that Hillary was saying about, and the question about the Iranian attitude toward the United States. I keep coming back to this. In 2009, in March, he'd been in office for 2 months, Obama released this video message for Iranian New Year, for Nowruz. And everyone made a big deal that, for the first time an American president actually let the official name of this country, the Islamic Republic of Iran, come out of his mouth. And he said he didn't try to play the government off the people. He addressed this video to the people and leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran, talked about how he wanted to resolve differences through diplomacy, basis of mutual interest, and in an atmosphere of mutual respect. Iranians thought this was great. 2 days later, on Nowruz itself, Ayatollah Khamenei gives an address every year in Mashhad. And the Iranians used that address to respond to Obama's video. The text of this message, I think, really kind of says it all about the Iranian attitude toward the United States. Khamenei goes through the usual litany of American, things that the Iranians perceive as American, crimes against Iran. But then he says that there is a new administration in Washington. We have no experience with this new administration. President Obama says he wants change. Okay. But change has to take place in more than just words. And I say to President Obama, if you change your policies towards us, we will change too. If you change your policies towards us, we will change too. And he says this in one of the most watched events in all of Iran. And from an Iranian perspective, in terms of actual U.S. policies towards them, the only change they have seen under Obama is that the policy's gotten worse. By contrast, show you what political will is, when Nixon came to office, one of the first things he did, knowing that he wanted to pursue this opening with China, one of the first things he did was to order the CIA to stand down from covert operations in Tibet. Likewise, he ordered the 7th Fleet to stop what the Chinese thought were overly aggressive patrol patterns in the Taiwan Straits. And he did that very deliberately because he said, when I go to the Chinese leaders telling them I want a different sort of relationship, they have to know that I'm serious. I think that's where we are with Iran. The Iranians from Ayatollah Khamenei on down are open to this. The people who tell you that, this system can never make peace with the United States are dependent on anti-Americanism. It's a fantasy. They are ready to come to terms with the United States if they understand that the United States is accepting this system.
Some people I know have to go. We're only scheduled to 5 o'clock. And in particular, I know that Professor Pastor has to go, so I want just kind of. But we will be here for a while. So anybody who has to go, wants to go, just wants some fresh air, please don't hesitate to get up. But we will stay.
Yes.
We're happy to continue the conversation with anybody who'd like to stay, and we're happy to talk about your question as well.
Okay, let me first, before thanking our speakers for what is a remarkable statement on their part in the book, also invite you 1 week from now. There is going to be a movie called A Whisper to a Roar, which is about democracy activists around the world. Larry Diamond, who's a professor at Stanford, an expert on democratization, will be here. It will be in Ward 1, Tuesday the 29th. There'll be free pizza. We'll have the movie and then a discussion afterwards and pizza in between, so I invite you to that. Now let me thank very much both Hillary and Flint for a remarkable presentation. I think they turned a lot of conventional wisdom on its head. You don't necessarily need to agree with everything that they just argued. I myself do not. But I do acknowledge that much of what they said is not just provocative, but penetrating. And hopefully will penetrate the debate that will be inevitably occurring both within the administration and within the country as well. So I ask all of you to join me in thanking them very much for coming.